Next speaker is Bobby. Everybody knows him as Bobby Kennedy Jr. An example of successful, effective, hard-driving environmental activism. I'm only going to tell you two things just to set up his presentation. What I think is ingenious about his organization, the Waterkeepers Alliance, is that it has a kind of self-fueling financial mechanism which permits idealistic and typically underfunded individuals to take on large polluters. And it is derived from apparently an old American statute that provides for the fact that anybody who successfully sues a polluter can keep half the fine as a bounty. Very interesting idea. And the second thing that Bobby has done is he's linked this activism to a law school and convinced the managers of the law school to allow students to work on actual real-life cases and get credit for it. So suddenly, the powerless have a bit of money, and some smart guys, men and women, who can then pursue these courses within the ambit of the law and succeed against enormous odds. The Waterkeepers Alliance has come to Canada, and that's how I came to meet Bobby. They've established a beachhead here called the Ontario Lake Keepers. The purpose of each cell is to look after a particular waterway and make certain that it stays clean or gets clean, or that the bad guys who have made it unclean pay for cleaning it up. Thanks, Bobby.
Thanks, Moses. Thank you. I want to first apologize because I've got laryngitis, but I think all of you will be able to hear me, and hopefully my voice will warm up by the time I get going. I just, you know, I didn't intend to talk about the Bush presidency much, and I really want to focus on some kind of big ideas about the environmental movement. But let me just say a couple of things, because we now have a president, and you're faced with some of the same choices here, where you have, you know, this choice between kind of laissez-faire, neocon vision for your country, and a different and more community-oriented vision. And I just want to say, talk a little bit about what's happened in the United States. In my experience, we have a president now that is trying to eviscerate 30 years of environmental law, 400 major environmental rollbacks. If you go to NRDC's website, if even a fraction of these gone through, and some of the worst ones already have, we will, by this time next year, have effectively no significant federal environmental law left in the United States. That's not exaggeration. That's not hyperbole. It is a fact. Many of our laws will remain on the books in one form or the other, but they'll be unenforceable and would be like Mexico, which has these wonderful poetic environmental laws, but nobody knows about them and nobody complies with them because they can't be enforced. And this is hurting us on the ground. Let me tell you just a couple of examples. 6 months ago, the New York Times did a story on a survey that showed that 1 out of every 4 black children in New York now has asthma. I have 3 sons who have asthma. We don't know why we're having this epidemic of asthma now, of pediatric asthma, but we do know that asthma attacks are triggered by 2 major components of air pollution, ozone and particulates. And in the United States, we know that 50% of those components in the New York area and most of the East Coast are coming from a tiny handful of coal-burning power plants in the Ohio Valley that are burning coal in a way that they're doing it illegally. They didn't install the right equipment. They've been doing it for 15 years illegally, or more in some cases. The Clinton administration was prosecuting them, some of them criminally, 75 plants. But this industry, between coal and the big coal-burning utilities, gave $48 million to President Bush during the 2000 campaign and have given $58 million since. And one of the first things that he did when he came into office was order the Justice Department to drop all of those lawsuits. Nothing like that has ever happened in American history before. Then the president changed the law so that those plants will never have to clean up those components. I live 2 miles from the state of Connecticut. In Connecticut, it is now unsafe to eat any freshwater fish in the state, except for one, hatchery-bred trout. In the state where I live, New York, almost all the fish are now unsafe to eat. In 17 states, it's now unsafe to eat any freshwater fish, and 45 states have advisories because of mercury. There's no geological source for that mercury in the state of Connecticut. It's coming, 50% of it, from those same coal-burning power plants in the Ohio Valley. Mercury, we now know, is in the bodies, has saturated the bodies of 1 out of every 6 American women of childbearing years to such an extent that their children are at risk for permanent IQ loss, 5 to 7 points typically. My doctor, I have enough mercury in my body because I got my test recently. My doctor said that if I was a woman of childbearing years and I had a child, it would have cognitive impairment. And I said, you mean might? And he said, no, the science is very certain that that child would have a cognitive deficit of 5 to 7 IQ points. It had a grim inventory of other diseases, kidney and liver disease, autism, blindness. That mercury, the Clinton administration recognizing that, classified mercury as a hazardous pollutant under the Clean Air Act, which required those plants to remove it within 3.5 years, 90% of it. It would have cost 1% of the value of those plants, a great deal for the American people, but it still meant a lot to those utilities, billions of dollars, and they contributed tens of millions of dollars to the president, as I said, and they've now got billions of dollars of relief. 6 weeks ago, the Bush administration abandoned those mercury regulations. It's also abandoned the statutory requirements, flaunted the statutory requirements that it cleans up acid rain. I live 3 miles from the Adirondacks. I take my kids fishing and hunting there, the oldest protected wilderness on the face of the planet. And half the lakes in the Adirondacks are now sterilized from acid rain, which has also destroyed the forest cover on the high peaks of the Appalachians from Georgia all the way up into Canada. And we know where it's coming from. The statute says they have to remove it, but the president has told industry to ignore the statute. I sued, some friends of mine sued the coal industry, same industry, for cutting the tops off the Appalachian Mountain, this horrible practice called mountaintop mining. And they dumped the tops of the mountains into the adjacent river valleys. They've destroyed, buried 1,200 miles of American streams, destroyed these historic landscapes. They're cutting them to the ground. An area the size of Delaware will be gone if he's elected to one more term. And it's illegal. Of course it is. We sued and we got an injunction against it. 2 days from when we got the injunction, the president changed the law so that now they will be able permanently to dump those mountaintops into our river valleys. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. Protecting the environment is not about protecting the fishes and the birds for their own sake. And this is one of the first ideas I want to talk about. It's about recognizing that the environment is the infrastructure of our communities, and that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities that will provide our children with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure. The second idea that I would put in front of you is the one that Moses just talked about. You've got to start locally, both nationally and locally, but the battles are local battles. Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local, even more so for environmental politics. And the group that I work for was started, the Waterkeeper Alliance, which I'm now president of, which all the riverkeepers from around the country, was started by this blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen. They were almost all former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II and Korea who were part of a town called Crotonville, New York. In 1966, they saw their river. They had little expectation they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone at the national parks. These were factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches and the swimming holes and the fishing holes of the Hudson. And they saw it being stolen from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. They'd been to the government agencies, the Corps of Engineers, the Conservation Department, the Coast Guard, that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. And they were given the bum's rush. And they had come to the conclusion in March of 1966 that government is in cahoots with the polluters, and that the only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And they came together, 300 of them, in an American Legion Hall to talk about blowing up pipes on the Hudson and jamming the pipes with mattresses and floating a raft of dynamite into the Indian Point power plant intake and putting a match to the oil slick that was coming out of the Penn Central Pipe in the Croton Harmon Rail Yard. And a guy came to that meeting who was another Marine, and he was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine, a great fly fisherman, Bob Boyle, one of the gurus of dry fly tying in our country. And he had discovered this ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act that said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States, that if you caught the polluter and turned him in and helped prosecute him, you could collect a bounty. And they started doing this. They collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in bounties against Hudson River polluters. We've brought over 300 cases. We've forced polluters to spend over $3 billion on remediating the river. Today, the Hudson River is an international model for ecosystem protection. It is the richest water body in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left in the North Atlantic that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. They use the money to launch a patrol boat, which today patrols the river. It's called the Riverkeeper. And they track down polluters and we prosecute them. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired now the creation of riverkeepers on waterways all across North America. We just licensed our 120th riverkeeper. We have explosive growth in Canada. We have riverkeepers. Each one has a patrol boat. Each one has a paid full-time riverkeeper. And each one has to be willing to sue polluters. And Mark Madison, are you here? Who's the Lake Ontario keeper, who's up there. And Mark is an attorney who has uncovered a very, very almost identical law here in Canada, the Fisheries Act, where you can collect bounties, and he's brought some of the first bounty cases in Canada. And we're licensing next week Fraser Riverkeeper, but we have them on Lake Ontario, on the Petitcodiac, on the Bow River, on the Bay of Fundy, and all over Canada. And within 5 years, we're going to have riverkeepers on every major waterway across Canada. The bad guys, the big polluters and their indentured servants in our political process, they'll tell you that we have to choose. We have to get rid of the environmental laws because we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. That is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our communities. If, on the other hand, we want to do what they've been urging us to do both in Ottawa and in Washington, D.C., which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they're never going to be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of the next generation. You know, the present shouts, the future whispers. And what environmentalists do, we're not here to protect the fishes and the birds, but to amplify the voices of those future constituencies who have the public trust rights that we are trustees guarding in those assets preservation for the next generation. But they're left out of the political process because politicians and industrialists have short horizons. And what environmentalists do is we bring the long horizon into the political debate and inject it into it. One of the issues that has really taken hold in Canada over the past several administrations is this idea of devolution, that, you know, we can't have the federal laws will return control of the provinces and the states. And after all, you know, they do the same thing in the United States. The local governments are in the best position to patrol and police and protect their own environments, and you know, that's local democracy, that's fundamental democracy. In truth, the real outcome of that devolution will not be local control. It will be corporate control, because these large corporations can so easily dominate the local political landscapes. And we remember in the Hudson Valley, the 1960s version of community control, before we had the federal environmental laws, when the General Electric Company, and this tale can be told 10,000 times across Canada and the United States, any place with a river. And General Electric Company was the big culprit in the Hudson Valley, and they came into these poverty-stricken towns in upstate New York, Fort Edward and Hudson's Falls, and they told the town fathers, we're going to bring you a spanking new factory, and we're going to raise your tax base, we're going to bring in 1,500 new jobs, and all you have to do is waive your environmental laws and let us dump our toxic PCBs into the Hudson River. And if you don't do it, we'll move to New Jersey, across the river, and we'll do it from over there. And they'll get the jobs and the taxes, but you'll still get the PCBs. Fort Edward and Hudson's Falls took the bait, and 2 decades later, General Electric closed the doors on those factories, fired the workers, and they left the Hudson Valley with their pockets stuffed with cash, the richest corporation in the history of mankind. And they left behind a $2 billion cleanup bill that nobody in the Hudson Valley can afford. And I have 1,000 commercial fishermen, my clients, who are now permanently out of work because although the Hudson is loaded with fish, the fish are still loaded with General Electric's PCBs, and they're too toxic to legally sell in the market. And the barge traffic on the river is dried up because the shipping channels are too toxic to dredge. And all of that beautiful shoreline property, the best, highest value property in those towns that was given to General Electric with tax breaks from the grateful localities is now permanently off the tax rolls, robbed from those communities as a source of revenue or recreation. And every woman between Oswego, New York, and Albany has elevated levels of PCB in her breast milk. And everybody in the Hudson Valley has General Electric's PCBs in our flesh and in our organs. My own PCB levels are double the national average. And what the federal environmental laws were meant to do was to put an end to that kind of corporate blackmail and to stop these corporations from coming in and whipsawing one community in New York against another in New Jersey, or one in Manitoba against another in Alberta, to get them to race to bottom, to lower their environmental standards, to recruit these filthy industries in exchange for the promise of a few years of pollution-based prosperity, and to ransom their children's futures in the process. And what the federal environmental laws did is they democratized our country. They allow us, to participate, the most vulnerable, alienated people, to demand an environmental impact statement, to force the proponents of projects to disclose the true costs and benefits of those projects to the community so that it gives them equality at the bargaining table, and to participate in public hearings and cross-examine witnesses and really participate meaningfully in the dialogue that determines the destiny of our community. I go out with all the other water keepers into the marketplace, and we catch the cheaters, and we say to them, we're going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. There's no stronger advocate for free market capitalism than myself. I believe that the free market is the most efficient and democratic way to distribute the goods of the land. And in a true free market economy, you would eliminate pollution and eliminate waste, because the free market spawns efficiency, and efficiency means you eliminate waste, and waste is pollution. But we don't have a free market. Jim Hightower said the other day, the free market economy is a great thing, we should try it sometime. What we have is, and if you look around, in a true free market economy, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else, and they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat who's using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public, you and I, to pay their production costs. That's what all pollution is about. When those coal companies, or when General Electric dumped its PCBs into the Hudson, it was avoiding one of the costs of bringing its product to market, which was the cost of processing a dangerous process chemical and properly disposing of it. And when it avoided the cost, it was able to outcompete its competitors and enrich its shareholder and board. But those costs didn't disappear. They went into the fish, and they made the people sick, and they put the men out of work, and they dried up the barge traffic, and they took the land off the tax rolls. And all of those impacts impose costs on the rest of us that should, in a true free market economy, be reflected in the price of General Electric's product when it makes it to the marketplace. And what all the federal environmental laws do in Canada and the United States is they're all about restoring free market capitalism in our country by forcing polluters to internalize the cost of production. And you have to do that at the federal level. And what I do is I don't even consider myself an environmentalist anymore. I'm a free marketeer. I go out with all the other water keepers into the marketplace, and we catch the cheaters, and we say to them, we're going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because when somebody cheats the free market, it distorts the entire marketplace. And none of us gets the advantages of the democracies and the efficiencies that the free market promises our nation. And what Americans and Canadians have got to understand, and particularly as you entered this debate over the next week, is that there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which democratizes our nation and makes us efficient and makes us strong and makes us a paradigm and example to the rest of the world, and corporate crony capitalism, which is as antithetical to democracy in America as it is in Nigeria. And that is what this administration in Washington, D.C. has given us. There's no free market left in agriculture, and the person who's running agriculture, in our country is, the second in command is a guy from Monsanto. The second in command of EPA is a guy from Monsanto. The head of the Forest Service is a timber industry lobbyist. The head of public lands is a mining industry lobbyist. We have corporations running our government, and you know what they call that? Fascism. Communism is the control. Communism is the control of business by government. Fascism is the control of government by business. And what we need is a middle path, which is free market capitalism, which enriches us, which democratizes us, but we have to be disciplined and we have to be educated to recognize when we're losing those things. I want to say one last thing, which is this, that the reason that we protect the environment, and this I started off with, is not for the sake of the fishes and the birds, it's for our sake, because we recognize that nature enriches us. It enriches us economically, yes, it's the base of our economy, and we ignore that at our peril. But it also enriches us aesthetically and recreationally and culturally and historically and spiritually. And human beings have other appetites besides money. And if we don't feed them, we're not going to grow up. We're not going to become the kind of beings that our Creator intended us to become. When we destroy nature, we diminish ourselves, we impoverish our children. We're not fighting to preserve those ancient forests in the Pacific Northwest, as Rush Limbaugh loves to say, for the sake of a spotted owl. We're preserving them because we believe the trees have more value to humanity standing than they would have if we cut them down. Thank you very much.